multiple units that look as if they're single family are actually a growing trend. This is actually a lesson that many nonprofits have learned, partly because community groups did not want little individual small-scale houses, the kind of, quote, monopoly house look, unquote, to be mixed in with their more gracious larger homes in their neighborhoods. One solution to that is to actually pull the houses together and create ganged houses together that actually look like one large home but contain 2, 3, or multiple units. And here we see these, what appear to be large homes, seen from an overhead view, actually, like a lot of older homes in American cities, are intentionally built with 2, 4, or 6 units. Sometimes over time, that was the result of the subdivision of a larger house, or in other cases, houses that were intentionally built that way. Let's start with Lake Park Townhomes in Issaquah, Washington. This is a new development. And if you look closely, you realize these actually are not big homes, but they're 2-unit buildings, sometimes with garages ganged at the center, sometimes at the side. Now, this is actually 7.8 units to the acre. Considering that Lytton Park and some of our single-family homes achieve the same density, one would want to ask, well, then why would you put the 2 units together to make one large home? Wouldn't 2 single-family detached houses with narrow side yards be preferable? And the answer in this case is no, for 3 reasons. One, these houses now look to be of the same scale of the gargantuan 4,000 square foot homes that are going up in this upper-class subdivision. The second thing is by ganging these houses and sharing an acoustically private party wall, some construction costs were reduced, and the savings were passed on to the consumer. And in third cases, actually this allowed for substantially bigger backyards. And with the same side yard requirements, the extra space was put into the backyard. So same density as a single-family detached, different strategy, different benefits. Here we are now in New England at Battle Farm. This is in an upper-income community also. And for similar reasons, the original proposal to meet an inclusionary requirement by having some tiny little houses scattered around the landscape was met with some derision. In this case, the architects and developers came up with a very New England-looking farmhouse. This looks like a big, old, traditional farmhouse. In the New England style, a series of outbuildings are attached behind the formal main house. But actually, if you look closely, there's multiple porches and front doors here. And when you go further into the development, you realize each one of these farmhouses has 3, 4, or in one case, 6 separate 2-bedroom units. The density achieved by this is 10 units to the acre. But that includes a huge public greens and a saved wetlands. So another benefit accrued to this model, a large woodland wetland area was saved. And so the 10 units an acre included a substantial amount of public open space. Here in Detroit at Field Street, almost a similar density, now we're actually at 12 units an acre, you can see the new house is actually a multiple dwelling. In this case, it's 4 units, 2 entered on the front porch, 2 by side doors. And those 4 units about take up the same volume as one of these old duplexes on the street on one side and a big old mansion next to it on the other side. You can see large front yards and side yards are typical in this neighborhood, but by going to this pattern, Field Street was able to get 12 units to the acre, whereas the prevailing density in this neighborhood was 1/2 to 1/3 of that. This kind of strategy can work in the country as well as the city. And here we are in Soquel, a rural part of California, where 13 units an acre was achieved in an area of very large single-family homes that were on 1/4 acre and 1/8 acre lots themselves, or rather at about 1/2 to 1/4 of the density of this development. In this case, an old farmhouse, as you see on the left, has been saved and renovated for the community house. And it sits across the street from the 1940s to 1960s houses of the neighbor. The new housing is built to look like large farmhouses, much like that New England example. And in this case, 4-unit buildings are built looking like one farmhouse, and then they are ganged to run along a meandering public open space, some of which is used as a community garden. In Fairfax, Virginia, both nonprofit developers and for-profits have faced the same kind of skepticism when they proposed these small little units, and they responded similarly with a historical housing type called the Great House. In this case, the Great House, looking very much like some of the upscale housing built in these large new subdivisions in Fairfax, actually houses either 2 or 4 units depending on the design. And in this case, this was intended as a prototype, a model house that could be infilled on a typical quarter-acre or eighth-acre lot in Fairfax County, with very different articulations at the ground floor and roof depending on the orientation. Complete with dormer windows and large arch windows, this looks incredibly like the $750,000 houses going up in the area, but it actually houses low-income people. There are large front yards. Parking is accessed from the back. The appearance of fitting into the neighborhood has been gained. Now, there's not as much private space as if you had separate houses here, but the feeling of being a partner and equal to the neighbors in this particular instance was certainly worth it. Also, because this is part of a master plan community, there's abundant public open space for all residents of the community, so having a lot of private open space on the lot in the form of backyards wasn't deemed essential. And that actually model, because it goes on varied lot sizes, varies from 8 to 16 units an acre. Now we're at Cape and Green, which is in Dorchester, Massachusetts. And this is an interesting project because you can see that the houses are actually 2 units, masquerading as one, and they alternately face the street on the length and then on the side. And this adds some variety, but it also allowed every other lot to be a little narrower and deeper and got actually a couple of more units in this one block than if all houses were the same and the broad side was facing the street. The other thing is that parking is ganged in the rear. There are fairly shallow front yards, and their houses are fairly close to one another, no closer than neighboring houses, but about 15 feet apart. And that allowed for fairly big backyards. Another feature of this particular development is the steep pitched roofs, which do echo the neighboring houses, enclose an undeveloped attic space, as well as there being a basement space. So families moving into here, as family membership grows through birth or through taking in in-laws, can add fairly inexpensively new space that they can occupy. So an expandable home. Now here's an interesting project in Oregon, and this actually is elderly housing. The Cape and Green development was 17 units an acre. This is called Sheridan Senior Estates, and it's 1-story high cottage bungalows at 18 units an acre. Actually, though, these bungalows house 2 units instead of 1 big unit. And to boot, the pitched roof allows for a sleeping loft, so the elderly people here, when they have a grandson or granddaughter staying over, those kids or young adults have a place to sleep. Very compact, but the landscaping and the detailing kind of fit into that character of a northwestern cottage-style architecture, and it's been well received in the small community of Mount Angel where it was built. A community that considers itself so rural that this development at 18 units an acre is considered the highest density allowed within about 10 miles of the town. In a suburban context, in an affluent community in California, the Willows infill homes in Menlo Park similarly tries to evoke a kind of arts and crafts style, which is very traditional in this area. What looks like a 1920s large house is actually 3 units, and here everything was done to sort of play down the front entries and play up the overall massing of the house. These aren't real fireplaces. They actually are clever ways that all those plumbing vents and flues and stove exhaust hoods are taken up and vented through the top of the roof in one place, but they evoke the notion of a house that's so grand it has 2 fireplaces. Headed back to the East Coast at the Hyde Square Co-op in Jamaica Plain, what's interesting about this example is that in the traditional neighborhood of Jamaica Plains, over time, a lot of the large old single-family houses were subdivided, and there was a mixture of what are called double and triple deckers, meaning flats stacked 1 or 2 on one another, as well as large single-family houses. So those 2 prototypes, the big house with the pitched roof, which actually houses 3 people, and off to the right of this picture, in this case, the triple decker, where 2 two-story units with their own very large back porches sit over 2 one-story units. And this actually achieves a surprising density. Hyde Street is at 22 units an acre. What made that possible, rather modest yards, and because of the quirkiness of the street grid, in some cases your parking is across the street in an infill lot. In some cases it's behind your car. But that actually is a fairly common pattern in Boston. And there are some very good public parks nearby, and so the relative small amount of private open space was not a concern.